Hi, good morning, everybody. We'll get started with Intacct reports. Today's agenda is we're gonna discuss briefly financial reports, but
A
less
participant
what they
has
look
joined
like
the
and more
meeting.
how to run them. There's different aspects to running these reports that I think a lot of our users aren't familiar with or don't take advantage of. So we're gonna get into some of those, and that will include the fiscal year reports, life-to-date reports, quarterly reports, and Intacct budget comparison. I'm also going to do an overview of the general ledger dimension balances. So that's going to be a useful report, especially like at the year end when people are trying to figure out what their encumbrances are, that kind of stuff. This is a great report, my go-to report for anything I do when I'm getting asked to give someone any help on something. We'll go through the check register. So if you're wondering if a check from a few months ago had been cashed, or you just want to know how many payments have been made to a certain vendor, this will be a useful report. And then the last thing I'll go through is purchasing transaction detail, which along with dimension balance report is probably the most powerful tool you can use when researching purchases. So fiscal year reports. Who uses these reports? Typically, if you're funded by the general fund through indirect cost by the casino, have a single year grant whose project period matches the tribe's fiscal year. So that's October through September. Or you operate through revenue funds, you're the type of program who's going to be using the fiscal year reports. There's a handful of those: fiscal year revenue and expenses, fiscal year revenue, fiscal year expenses, and then those that show only one fund are the same set that shows all of your funds through that one request. And so that's what the fiscal year reports are intended to cover. Our life-to-date reports are for multi-year grants, so it's grants that have multi-year contracts. IHS and 638 are probably the two that come to mind. We have a handful of others that also have multi-year grants. So you're likely using the life-to-date reports if you have those. A single year grant whose project dates are outside of the tribe's fiscal year. Programs like Head Start and Early Head Start have different fiscal years than the tribes. So they use life-to-date to make sure all of their expenses that span two different fiscal years for the tribe can be collected in one report. Diabetes runs through a different fiscal year, and there's a handful of others. Just wanted to list a couple of examples. So life-to-date's good if you want information for your funding source from when it began through the most current time, or whatever date you've put in on the as of date. As we've finding out, especially like the 638 programs in IHS, the life-to-date reports is a huge report to build. It requires a lot of information, and if our bandwidth isn't up to snuff, we can time out when we're running the report. And so I would recommend people run what I have on screen here, process and store. It allows us to run a report on the servers of Intacct rather than our own computer. It's not going to tie up your computer's processing power or bandwidth while we're waiting for it to build. Instead, it runs at Intacct servers. And if you have your preferences turned on so that you can receive messages from Intacct about stored reports, when the report is ready, Intacct emails you and tells you the report you've requested is ready to be looked at. And so it's a great thing to do, and it's usually faster than running the report directly on your computer. So we're going to look at that momentarily. We're also going to look at the quarterly reports. It's designed to show us encumbrances in actual by quarter, but that's based on the tribe's fiscal year. So let's get into Intacct to start this. So the first batch of reports I'm going through is in the report center, which we find by opening our application menu, going to reports, clicking on report center. When we get here, the type of reports available to you are based on your access. So if you see reports on this list that you don't have access to, not a big deal. I'm only going to go through the ones that everyone has access to. But at the top of our screen, we have favorites, all reports, memorized, scheduled, my reports, custom reports. For the most part, as a user at your level, we should either be at favorites or all reports. All reports would mean every report that's on your list that you have access to, you can now see. Favorites, on the other hand, only lists those that we clicked on the star next to, making it our report favorite. So now my report list has shrunken down quite a lot by using favorites. So the great thing to use to filter out stuff you don't use. And so you'll go to reports, you go to favorites, and you can always find it much easier than having to read through all the other stuff that you don't use. So if you're only using fiscal year reports and you don't ever want to run a life-to-date report, make the fiscal year reports your favorites, and they'll always just show up on favorites. You don't have to sift through all the other stuff. The only thing I would suggest, though, is if you use favorites and you can't find a report that you want to see, just make sure you click back to all reports, and then everyone else will appear. Memorized, scheduled, and my reports basically won't be useful at the program user level. And then custom reports will let us see special reports I've built that you may find accessible to you, which like the purchasing transaction deal report that I'll go through here shortly. But for me, I just stick out all reports. We have a drop-down box to change reports by type, financial report, or purchasing, accounts payable, and a handful of others. And we also have a search bar. So if we were looking for those fiscal year reports, and granted, everything's in alphanumeric order. So if we're looking for a fiscal year report, we would scroll until we get to the F section. Now we can find those reports. If we're having difficulty, we can start typing the name of a report. And as I type, Intacct will start to filter out the stuff that doesn't match with what I'm typing. So now everything that has the word fiscal in it is showing up under financial reports and the general ledger. And there's no other type of report that has the word fiscal in it. So these are the two sections that are showing up. So it's a pretty nifty tool to quickly get to a report you want to find. But when we talk about the fiscal year reports, and this goes for the life to date also, we have two ways to run a report basically. You can click on the blue hyperlink, basically the text, which is the report name. And then Intacct will prompt us to tell it what information do we want to use. So that's one option. And the other option is to export as. We have HTML, which is also the default option if we click on the text. We have PDF. So if we know we're going to print this report or we're looking for this because we want to attach it to our budget mod, we're going to email it to somebody, this would be the easiest thing to do first. Otherwise, if we open it up as we normally would and then want to print it, we basically have to run the report twice. So skip one of those steps by using export and choosing the format. And then we also have CSV and Excel. So if you want to take the report into a different format like CSV or Excel so you can do more customization to the report, by all means do that. Intacct's limited with the type of customization like highlights or different fonts, that kind of stuff. So if you're wanting to be able to do that to make your font bigger, or there's certain things that you want to highlight, by all means take it to Excel and do that yourself. And so we're going to run a fiscal year expense report, one funding source view, meaning I just want to see one fund. And so for all users at the program level, we have to include a program and a checkbook at minimum. If we leave any of this information blank, you'll get an error message. I don't remember exactly what it says, but it's something about multiple entities. So if we're not including this information as a program user, you're going to run into difficulty running a report, and that's any report in Intacct. These are the minimum amount of things that you need to include. If you know the funding source, you can type it here. If not, and I leave this blank, I'm going to leave it blank on this one. It'll include any funding source that matches this combination of program and checkbook. Just so happens for council, there's only one funding source that matches this, so not too big of a deal. If we had multiple funding sources, and I do this and I run the report, it'll combine all of those funding sources and give us one report. So you want to be real careful here with what we tell Intacct we want it to do. So I'm going to leave that blank. We have an option to run for a vendor. So if we wanted to see a financial report as it only concerns Cherry Todd or any kind of vendor that we have, we can include them, and then we'll just get that information for there. And then the last thing is the as of date. So this tells us, or tells Intacct, we want a fiscal year report to a specific date. It defaults to today's date. So when I run this report, encumbrances and the year-to-date expense totals will go from October 1st through today. And then the month-to-date total on the report will be January, since that's a January day. If I change this date to another day, of course, that then modifies the type of information I'm getting back from Intacct. If I wanted it to just be through December, and then ran this report, I would get a fiscal year 21 report with all financial information ending on December 31st. If I wanted to see information from fiscal year 2020, obviously the current date won't work for me for that. I would have to use a date that's within fiscal year 20. Typically, we use the last day of the year so we can get a fiscal year report for all of fiscal year 20 as of 9/30. And so that's how we can manipulate the report then to start to get information for different periods of time. So hopefully we found that useful. But we're going to leave it for the current date for this example here. And so remember, I've clicked on the text and not as export as. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and we're going to let the report run. Fairly quick report for the general fund. Now we have this information. It's an HTML format, so anything blue I can click on and dig into for more information. Basically, it takes us to our general ledger report for detail. But we get the basic information we'd want to know about our program for the fiscal year. If this was a report I was going to use for my basis of a budget mod, now I need it as a PDF, right? So I'd have to print, and the report's going to run and build again back to a PDF. So fortunately, this isn't a report that takes very long, so not a lot of time lost doing an unnecessary step for that. But if we use the export as option, we could have cut out that middle report, if that makes sense. And so now if we go to export as PDF, we get the same prompts. And now we can run the report. So instead of getting the HTML version first, I've gotten this. So if we're running reports every day, it's going to save us a few seconds every day, right? So easier way to do this. Now to the life to date reports. Running them is the same exact way as a fiscal year report. But the thing I want to talk about is process and store. So we can run it by clicking on here and then letting the computer do the job for us while we wait for it to run, kind of tying us up. We can export it to a different format. Same thing is going to happen. Or we can go to more actions and choose process and store. So for those of you who have multi-year grants or funds that go beyond the tribe's fiscal year, this would be the perfect thing to do. So we go to process and store, and we get a little bit different prompts here. So what day do we want to run the report on? So we can kind of schedule a report. So if we knew on Monday morning we want to have a report ready for us to see, we could come here and say we want the report to run on January 18th. So that's always an option. So we kind of have the same prompts. We're going to put in our checkbook. We'll put in our program. I'm not going to list a funding source. I'm not going to choose a vendor. And do we want to run this report for the general fund for tribal council for the life to date through today or through which date? So I'll leave it at today. And now we want to tell Intacct how to deliver that information to us. Everyone should use Store in Intacct. We don't have anything for storing in cloud to like a Google Drive setup. So just keep it on Store in Intacct. Choose your format that you would like. I'm going to choose printable, which means PDF. And we click OK. Report is being processed. Check my stored reports for the report results. And so now we wait until we get that magical email from Intacct to tell us the report's ready. On the report center above the More Actions page at the top of the screen, there's a hyperlink for View Stored Reports. When we go there, we can see reports that we've stored. If you've done this any other time, you would see the list. These 3 reports are complete and ready to go. So I can click on the PDF or CSV and the report will download to my computer. The one I just created says in process. So eventually, when that's done, that'll change to say PDF and we'll know that the report is ready. For those of you here now, have we used process and store to run a report? Okay, maybe not. But this would be a great way for you to get the access to the report. And when you're at the page, you can refresh to see, has that changed? Or go about your business and wait for the email. So now we'll go back to Report Center. And we're going to look at the quarterly report. So instead of scrolling down and searching through it, I'll start typing quarter, and here we are. It's much better to use the process and store Lynette, especially on Life Today. So here we are with the quarterly report. Let's run that. We keep using council as a program, so we're going to do that. So it wants the same information: what program, what checkbook, which funding source, and what date. The quarterly report is for a single fiscal year. So whatever date I use, it's going to base the quarters on the tribe's fiscal year. So quarter 1, October to December, quarter two, January to March, April to June, and then July to September would be the quarters. So I'm going to leave it at January 14th and we'll run the report. And this one might take a little longer than a regular report to run since it's got a little bit more information it has to build. So here you are with the quarter report. We get the full year's budget that's currently available for the funding source that we ran the report for. The quarter ending 12/31, here's open encumbrances. And for the fiscal year, here's the open encumbrances. So they match up. And what we also see is we don't see a quarter ending for January 14th, meaning there's been no encumbrance activity so far in the second quarter for these funds. And then separate, we have the actual expenditures. Quarter ending December 31st, quarter ending through January 14th, and then the totals of those two quarters so far. So if, like finance monitors might find this useful for completing their quarterly reports that they have to do for the FFRs. If you have any reporting for this as a program, you can use it this way also. So it's a valuable report for those regards. And just like anything else that runs the same way, I could print to get this as a PDF. I can hit Excel if I want to export this to a different format. Or if I want to email this to somebody, I can hit email. That person doesn't have to be an Intacct user. So if there's another employee in your program or whoever you're sharing this with, you can use the email function. And that's for our quarterly report. The last financial report is the Intacct budget comparison report. If you are doing a budget mod or a change request in Martis, this is a great report to run before you start your budget mod if you're not sure which fiscal year your budget might be sitting in. And so this report runs the same way as the others. So I've got council and general account again through today. Okay. While this was running, has anyone used the Intacct budget comparison report for any purpose in Intacct? Okay. So these general funds we use year over year. So here's the funding source name. Here's the fiscal years that the funds have been used or not used in this case for the fiscal year 17. And we can see side by side the existing budgets. So if we weren't sure which fiscal year we were supposed to be using for a budget, the multi-year grants would log in and they would just see a budget typically in 1 year. And so they would see whatever column, FY19 or 20, whichever, and then say, okay, now when I go into Martis, I know where to go immediately to start my budget mod. If we were planning our budget, we're already almost halfway through this fiscal year, we could run this report and then say, what is trending in my budget? Is there a certain expense line that's increasing each year that I've been using my budget, or are we seeing decreases, that kind of stuff? Quick and simple thing to do without having to run 4 different reports just to get budget numbers. And of course, it only gives us the budget. It doesn't give us any expense information. So whatever we spent, we can't see. We can only see what we budgeted. And so we can see the different changes year over year from FY18 to a jump in 2019 back down to the normal level of FY20. And then this year, I think there's been 4 months of budget approved through general, maybe 5, I forget. So there's this far less than the previous year so far. And they even have a funding source that we stopped using in 2017 still shows up. We can see what that budget was then as well. So great for planning your budgets. Even better for using for Martis. Okay, before I move out of financial reports, does anyone have questions about the financial reports? Okay. The next thing we'll discuss is the general ledger dimension balance report. So that you're not going to find in the report center, but you're going to find that by going to general ledger, and in the report section, there's a list of reports, and we have dimension balances. Similar to the financial reports, one of the first things we're going to have to do is tell it, what period of time do we want to see this report for? It's at current month as of January 14th. So if we only wanted to see information for January, we can do that. Or we can choose different periods of time based on this drop-down list of, I don't know, like maybe 70 different periods. If we don't want to do that, you can always click into here and just type a beginning and closing period of time. Usually what I do, it's much faster. And whatever we type here overrides the selection up here. So if you want to use this for reporting period and as of date, make sure these two fields are blank. Otherwise, this will override those selections. So I want to see fiscal year 20. The reporting book currently selected is our accrual book. And that's where our expenses are booked to. I'm not going to look for expenses in this case. What I want to do is I want to look for encumbrances. And so we don't see encumbrances here. So what I need to do is select this box here where it says other books. And now we get a list of available books that we can select from. We only have one other, it's encumbrances. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and click done. This checkbox tells us it's combining the books, encumbrances, and accrual. I don't want to. I only want encumbrances. So I'm going to leave that unchecked because I just want the encumbrances. I don't want to combine that with accrual. Then we need to tell Intacct what type of accounts do we want to look for. We can do a range of accounts. If we were researching employee wages through employee recognition, we can do a range like that, and the report will then deliver to us finances based on this range of accounts. Multiple accounts. If our account numbers didn't fall in a range, we wanted our wages, our utilities, and office supplies. We can then select those, and that's the results we'll get is based on those multiple accounts we've selected. So it's completely up to you what information for you to get back in this report. We could choose all accounts if, hey, we just want to see every single thing that we might possibly have a transaction for, then keep your option on all accounts. To make this report easy, I'm just going to select the utilities account. So I'm only wanting to see transaction and utilities through the encumbrances for fiscal year 20. Now we need to tell Intacct to break this report down for us. I have access to more than one program, so I'm going to use all programs. I want to know this for the general account. I'm not going to specify a funding source because I want to get the encumbrances open on utilities for any program in the general fund. We can specify then if we're using customer on any of these purchases, we can type in a customer. If it was utilities and we only wanted to know about Cherry Todd, by all means, we can keep that vendor and type in Cherry Todd. I'm gonna leave this blank though because I want it to be any vendor possible. If we were looking at employee wages and we just wanted to get quick information about a specific employee, here's our chance to select that person without having to go to Workforce Go and figure out how do we build a report for there to see the cost of someone during a period of time. Class, we've all been selecting COVID-19 or regular. If we only wanted to filter only our regular purchasing, by all means, we can do it that way too. But I'm leaving the rest of the stuff blank because I don't want to miss anything. Then we can select what information do we want to add to this report. So I have funding source ID and vendor name selected. The order this is in also affects the order the report will be delivered to us. So by funding source ID being first, it's going to organize all the information in order by funding source ID first, and then by vendor ID. So once I have that stuff selected, I click view. This is going to run, and now we can see for the general fund in utilities, the TechRow funding source has two open encumbrances, encumbrance totals, one for solid waste and one for tribal energy. And we can see those dollar amounts. So if any of you ran a report and included fiscal year 20 for your program and fund information, you can get a report similar to this. And so now if we weren't sure what's going on, we need to dive a little further. Where's this $37.99 from? What's happening with this? So let's click on $37.99. And what that does is it takes us to the general ledger report where we can see the detail of that account number. So we can see these two instances of when purchase requisitions were created. And then all these credits, we can see the memo says commitment release. So we were probably converting our purchase orders to a voucher, making some sort of payment or something, right? But whatever we've done, we've left $37.99 hanging out there. And so where would that have come from? And looking at this would be difficult still to tell where the culprit is for $37.99. So we can actually click on the dollar amounts, and it takes us to the journal entry created from the purchasing activity, and there's a link to go to the purchase requisition. So now we're into purchasing through the general ledger. Here's our purchase requisition. We'll view that and go to its history. And so for those of you here on Tuesday, remember, we were looking at the history of purchasing, and we see a bunch of stuff. We see a purchase rec that became a PO, that became 7 vouchers, and then eventually I closed it in November. Seemingly, everything should look fine. But when we look at the states of these documents, we have a voucher that was declined going back to January of 2020. So if we click on this voucher, what are the odds this is going to be $37.99? So in like 5 minutes time, we've identified the problem, and now we can fix that. So how would we fix this encumbrance from last year hanging out there, or what should we have done? We would have to go to the voucher screen, look up this voucher 43282, delete the voucher if it's not supposed to be paid. It reopens the purchase order, then we can close the balance of that $37.99. If it's supposed to be paid, then this document should have been edited, whatever problem corrected, and then resubmitted to process the payment. So like from October through now, frequent emails I get each day are, why do I have this encumbrance, or what is this? This is what I do. There's no magic button for us to find out what it is other than actually looking for it. And this is a pretty easy way to do that. Okay, any questions on dimension balance reports? So these reports we can view just like I had done. You can print if you want it to be a PDF. We can email this to another person, or we can export it to another format. I have a couple options you guys don't have, but those are our typical ones that all users will have: to view, to print, email, or export it. All right, so we're going to move on from dimension balances report to our last report, purchasing transaction detail. So this was a great tool, but let's keep this Tecro stuff in mind. Let's go to purchasing transaction detail. So here we can go to purchasing. We have reports. Purchasing transaction detail isn't listed amongst the reports, but there is a custom reports area. I go there, there's a whole bunch of those things. And we can scroll until we get to purchase transaction detail. So very similar to what we just did, we can look at a certain period of time. So it's at fiscal current year to date. If I change the date to 9/30/20, this is going to include the fiscal year through 9/30/20. In other words, fiscal year 20. We'll do checkbook 3. We'll focus just on Tecro now because we've seen that one or those two encumbrances out there. That wasn't our utilities line, so I'm going to select utilities. You could leave it blank if you wanted it for all of your items that you've used before, regardless of whatever they are. We can put in our funding source if we want to make sure it's just specified to that one specifically. And then we're left with two things that's going to call on your knowledge, your wherewithal about how Intacct works. Type. What type of purchasing transaction should I look up? So it gives us the list of all the purchasing transactions available in Intacct. We can select one of those if we only want to research one kind. I'm going to leave it blank. I want any type of purchase transaction to come through. State. Any state those documents can have. We've seen that declined one, so let's certainly going to click declines. And for those of you who were in Tuesday's training, we know that things that are partially approved and submitted aren't affecting our encumbrances yet if it's a purchase requisition. But if it's a voucher that hasn't been approved, that means our encumbrance hasn't cleared. If something's pending, that means it's waiting for us to do something. If something's partially converted, means we haven't converted all of it yet, if it was a blanket purchase order. So I now have all the possible states that can contribute to our encumbrances. Decline, submitted, partially approved, pending, partially converted. If there was a certain vendor we wanted to look up, we can choose the one vendor. There was 2 different ones that were on the list, so we're not even going to bother with that. We're just going to click view. And we end up getting 3 things. We have 2 declined vouchers. Here's the one we were looking at. And separately to Tribal Energy, we have a declined voucher for $11, and we have a partially converted purchase order for $960. So now when one reports, we have easily identified the things that are contributing to our encumbrance balances. For an account number, we have the 3 documents that are doing that. We know what vendors they're for. And pretty much all the information we would want to know about our purchasing transactions is in this report, all the way across. Our vendor document number, our memo that we put on there, all of that stuff. So for me, this purchase transaction detail, most powerful report you can use because of this very thing. Even links us right to the document. So I click on the purchase transaction detail. We can see they had a $960 purchase order, of which they've so far had only converted $73. And this is a purchase order dated a year and 3 months ago. So at that point, now we know as the program, maybe we need to close this. There's that other voucher that was declined. We also have a declined voucher out there. So I would first delete the voucher so all the PO becomes available, and then convert that to close it. Date it for 9:30 and our work would be done. All right. Any questions about purchase transaction detail reports? Only thing I would suggest to users out there is run the report to get familiar with it. This recording will be available, so you can refer to this, but it's going to be an hour-long recording, so it might be hard to skim through on a YouTube video. On my website, I have a video that's only about purchase transaction detail reports. It's like 5 minutes long. So if you want to practice, do that. Figure this out. How can I run a report for my funds for a specific vendor or a specific account, or for everything, or for everything that's pending? These are all options to you. Okay, so we're gonna get into our last report, bonus report, check register. How many checks have we written to a vendor, or that kind of stuff. So under accounts payable, we all have access to that. Under reports, we have an area called registers. And just like the old way of keeping track of our checkbooks, we have a check register. And just like anything else, what period of time do we want to see? If I leave it at current month, and I want to see the report as of maybe just for the month of September, could I leave it on current month and get a September report, even though it's January? And the answer would be yes. I'm going to change that date to September 30th. Is there a certain vendor I want to see? Let's look at Cherry Todd. We'll use checkbook 3. We'll do all programs again. There's an option here to see check numbers. So if you know a check number and you were just researching who was that for, that kind of stuff, you can find that information using a check number here. Do we want to see details on these checks? I'm not going to use details in the moment. Do I want to look for only checks that are voided, only check transactions? As we know, we pay our utilities through ACH funds. So if I wanted to not include ACH funds, I can just say show only the check transactions. And show me the reconciliation status, meaning has Lori reviewed the bank statement versus Intacct to clear any of the transactions that's occurred. So yes, we want to know the reconciliation status. And now let's view this report. So with the information we have at hand, we now know Cherry Todd, we've had about eight different checks. We have the days. The document number is this really long number, so we know these are ACH payments. Our check numbers are 5 digits long, so none of these are actual checks. We know the amounts, and there's a clear date here. So we know that Lori has completed her bank reconciliation for her September, and all of these items are verified as having cleared through Wells Fargo for Cherry Todd. So if we were looking up a vendor payment, some vendor called you and said 4 months ago you were supposed to pay a bill, and you look at an Intacct and you've seen that yes, the voucher has been done, you could run a check register report in a matter of seconds and know already before you contact finance whether or not the check has cleared through the bank by having this date here. If it says in transit, it means it hasn't been cleared. Now, there's a little delay on this because it's done by bank statement. So for the month of December, those statements are now coming in, so each account's getting reconciled now. So for anything recent, that might be more difficult, but certainly for things that are starting to be 2 months old, we could definitely look and see in this check register if it's cleared the bank. And if we see a clear date, now we can notify our vendor, hey, Cherry Todd, we have confirmation it's cleared through the bank. So they may need to check their records. Or if it says in transit, okay, we have a problem here. So do we need to request that the check be voided and then reissue a new check to satisfy the vendor? Okay, any questions about a check register? Okay, well, that's all the reports I'm going through today. Since I don't see any other questions that's up here, thank you guys for coming today. I'll be editing the video so I can make the recording available to you, and the presentation I had built that I kind of based this whole thing on, I'll email it to you guys, but you can always go to ljstraining.info, and if I go to Intacct in the reporting section, I have that I have it ready to load here, so you'll find it on this page. It's right here at the bottom with a blank spot waiting for this presentation to be loaded next to it. So it's a good spot to use. And here's videos, a 2-minute video how to look up your budget in Intacct, a minute video on how to do the budget comparison. There's that purchasing transaction detail report. 2 minutes if you're ever unsure. So, all right. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Have a good rest of your day.